This is a video that I've been wanting to make for such a long time. There are so many crazy myths and bad houseplant hacks available online nowadays, meaning that a lot of seemingly good advice is just well-marketed bamboo. It can be hard to know what to believe and what's actually going to do good for your houseplants. So today I have gathered 20 houseplant myths that I'm commonly presented with and often come up in the comments section of my videos, and I thought we could debunk them together. But first, if you're new here, hi, my name's Claire and this is Yoli. I make videos all about houseplant care, sharing tips and tricks I've learned over the years to help keep your plants happy and healthy. And there's a fair few myths on this list that I myself have believed over the years. So yes, I hope you enjoy it. Let's get into it. So the first houseplant myth that I have on my list today to debunk is that flowering is always a sign that a plant is happy, and that is not the case. This is something that I only found out quite a long way into my plant journey. I would always think that if my plant started flowering, I was like, woohoo, I'm clearly doing something right. And a lot of the time, yes, that can be the case. However, if you think about what the purpose of flowers actually is in a plant's natural habitat, it's pollination, it's propagation, it's the plant essentially trying to create more of itself and continue the cycle. And for that reason, sometimes if you've got a plant that is not happy, it will start trying to reproduce at sometimes a crazy rate in order to make sure that when the main mother plant, the body of the plant, dies, it will leave offspring. And a really good example of this, it isn't a flower per se, but I just think a very good example is something like the spider plant. Often you will see spider plants throwing off like loads of little plantlets hanging down. And I had a spider plant in my mum's conservatory, and the plant suddenly started looking really, really unhappy. And all of a sudden I noticed that it was propagating itself like crazy. I was like, oh, it must be really happy. It's got loads of little babies. And actually, when I read up on it, I was like, interesting. The mother plant was essentially so root bound because it needed a pot upgrade. It thought it was going to die. And so therefore it was trying to put out lots more plants in order to save itself. So sometimes if you're, like, for example, if you haven't repotted a plant in a while, or if you've got a plant that you haven't been paying much attention to and you're not quite sure if it's happy and it suddenly starts trying to reproduce or flower, it might be something worth looking into. I've got a Hoya, for example, my Hoya latifolia sarawak, and if you've been on my channel for a while, you might remember when I was at the flat, my old flat, it suddenly started blooming like crazy. I think I actually made a video on it, so I will put it on the screen so that you can see. So this Hoya's just finished flowering and I've just removed some of her petals, and I've noticed she's actually got a twin peduncle just here, and I think she's getting ready to flower again. I was like, why has it got so many peduncles? I hadn't had a new leaf from that plant in about a year, and yet it was giving me flower after flower after flower. And when I investigated and when I looked into the roots, I could see that the roots were actually not in a good state whatsoever. I eventually decided to chop that plant up and propagate it. And once it had rooted and I potted it all back up again, it's been giving me so much more foliage, and I'll get the occasional flower, but it's not quite so intense compared to how it was before. So always think of everything your plant does, including flowering, as a signal in some way, and perhaps a sign that you might need to mix things up. Not always, but sometimes. The second houseplant myth is that root rot is always caused by too much water, and a lot of the time, again, that can be the case. It is a very common misconception to think that this is the only cause, but actually most of the time when it comes to root rot, it actually comes down to poor aeration that causes the roots to start rotting, as opposed to actually giving your plants too much water. And I always bang on about the fact, if you're using a soil mix, make sure you're using something that that isn't too dense and compact, purely because the roots of your plant do need to breathe. Although overwatering, yes, can play a really big part, a lot of the time overwatering is much harder to do if your plants do have good aeration around them. For example, in plants' natural habitat, obviously we don't wait until the soil is half an inch dry. It will rain when it rains, and nothing is scheduled, nothing is kind of monitored. And a lot of the time, because the roots have more space and they do have the aeration they need, that is why they don't suffer from root rot in the same way as they do when we grow them in a home environment as pot plants. Again, this is one of the reasons why for a lot of plants that are quite prone naturally to root rot, like for example alocasia, I really like to use things like semi-hydro, and the semi-hydro mix that I use is quite chunky. It looks like that, and it just means that your plants are able to not only absorb all of the water and the nutrients they need, but they are also able to breathe. But again, when it comes to overwatering, this again is something that I think a lot of people don't fully understand, and for a very long time I didn't either. A lot of the time you'll hear overwatering and you will just think, oh, that's giving your plants too much water in one session. And actually, if you've got good drainage, that's kind of impossible to do. When I water my plants, I just make sure that they are actually ready for a water. Overwatering only happens when you water your plants when they're not ready, because essentially the roots can't process any more water, and that sends them into meltdown and causes things like root rot and stem rot and fungal issues and all of the nasty things. But if you make sure you have good drainage, a good substrate, whether that's soil, semi-hydro, and you have an understanding of your plant's watering needs, whether or not it likes to dry out slightly between waterings, whether it prefers to remain consistently moist, then chances are you will not have to deal with root rot. The next myth is that you should never cut or trim the roots of your plant. Again, this is something that I was terrified of doing back in the day when I first started out with plants. If I was repotting, I was like, oh my goodness, don't break any roots. And nowadays, especially if I've got a plant that's quite well established, I really don't worry too much. And that's purely for the fact that actually a little trim here and there to your plant's roots has actually been proven to help stimulate growth in the foliage. So actually it can help to strengthen your plant as time goes on. And I have done this for many of my plants over the years, but one that I did it with recently, and I know I did it in a video and some of you guys absolutely freaked out, was my variegated musa. And I gave it a pretty big root prune, and a lot of you were saying, oh my goodness, it's not going to make it, what are you doing? And I just want to show you that plant now. It's only been about a month, and look at the size of the leaves it's been giving me since I did that. And again, already this plant is getting very, very, very rooty in the container that it's in. So I think on the cards very soon is, yes, going to be a pot upgrade and another little root prune, because I can tell that the plant has benefited from it. The one thing I would say, if you are going to give your roots a bit of a prune back, I personally would usually choose to go for the spindly roots as opposed to the kind of like beefy, chunky roots, just because typically the spindly roots are the ones that firstly are more prone to rotting, and your plant can usually rebuild them a little bit better than it can the big, chunky, beefy roots. Also, I'm not sure what the science is behind this, but I have heard as well that trimming back the smaller kind of spindly roots can help the plant to push its energy into producing much thicker, beefier, chunkier roots, and those are the ones that we like to prioritize. The next one is that pebble trays don't work. And I understand why people say pebble trays don't work, because if you just use 1 or 2 pebble trays, it's probably not going to do that much. For those of you that don't know, pebble trays are often used to help raise the humidity in a space instead of using a humidifier. They are literally just trays of water with pebbles in. You sit your plants on top, the water will evaporate and add humidity to the air. And yeah, as I say, if you're going to put like a plant on a pebble tray, it's probably not going to do a huge amount. However, whenever you add water to a space in enough kind of quantity as it starts to evaporate, it is going to help. I know that as soon as I started again growing more semi-hydroponically and propagating in water more, I noticed that I wasn't having to use my humidifier as much, purely for the fact that there was just naturally more water in the air. The other thing that is not pebble trays, but it is a DIY little hack that you can use in order to help raise the humidity in a space if you don't want to invest in a humidifier, is just leaving laundry out to air dry. I will often bring my clothes horse through to this space overnight. I will hang all my clothes on there to dry, and then in the morning I will come through and I'll notice that the humidity is just higher. So there are plenty of DIY things you can do. You just need to stay on top of them a little bit more than you might do if you were to get a humidifier and set it to run. Number 5 is that if a plant drops its old leaves, it means it's dying. And this is absolutely not the case. In fact, it is a really, really common thing with houseplants to kind of conserve their energy as they continue to grow. Again, something like alocasia is a really good example, this genus, to use when it comes to dropping old leaves, because alocasias are quite well known for doing what we commonly known as cycling, and that will be putting up a new leaf and then the old one dying back, and kind of continuing to go through that cycle as the plant grows and matures and gets bigger and bigger. But all types of plants can do it. I would only start to be concerned if this was happening incredibly regularly. Like, for example, if you had a vining plant that had 20 leaves on it and within the space of a couple of weeks it had lost like 6 leaves, then I would investigate, and I would kind of maybe again check the roots. That's always my first port of call. Check the roots, see what's going on, make sure they're healthy. But otherwise, I would just say it's a natural process the plant goes through. Every single time an older leaf dies back, you'll notice that leaf starts to go quite yellow. And what it's actually doing is it's passing the nutrients from that leaf back to the main body of the plant so that it can conserve energy and pump that into new growth. So it's really nothing to worry about. The only time that I would be concerned is if the new growth starts to die off. That again typically signals, not always, but typically signals something going on with the roots. So again, I would check that. If the roots are all fine, just have a reevaluate of your plant's conditions. Make sure you've optimized its lighting, temperature, humidity, all of these things. But yeah, old leaves dying back here and there is definitely nothing to worry about, and it definitely doesn't mean your plant is dying. The next one is that mayonnaise is great for creating shiny leaves. And oh my goodness, this feels like a lockdown hack to me. I remember when this was circling the internet, people were using milk, mayonnaise, butter, the coconut oil was another one, all of these things to rub on their plants' leaves and make them look really glossy and really shiny. Please don't do this to your plants. Yes, temporarily it might make them look quite shiny, but all you're going to be doing, firstly, is clogging the pores of your plant and meaning that they can't breathe, they can't transpire in the way that they need to, but also you're making them so much more at risk, so much more at risk. You're putting them more at risk of burning, because anything you cover in oil and then put next to a window is probably going to frazzle in no time. So although it might look great for the first day or two, it's not worth it long term if you want to keep your plant. If you want to make the leaves look lovely and shiny, then the best thing to do is to take a damp cloth and just give them a regular wipe over. That will keep them dust free. It will allow them to be able to photosynthesize and absorb all of the wonderful things in your home, but don't go putting anything else on the leaves. Number 7, you can't repot over the winter months. This is a thing that has come up time and time again on my channel, and I speak from personal experience. All of this is my personal opinion, personal experience, but I have got a lot of plants. I have had a lot of plants for many years now. But I personally continue to repot all year round, even when we're in the dead of winter, so long as I make sure that I can keep the conditions stable for my plants. The times where I wouldn't repot, and actually the same goes for propagating a plant, the times where I wouldn't do it is if I had a plant that firstly hadn't been doing particularly well, had been in a period of dormancy that wasn't related to the root system. Like if I've got a plant that hasn't been growing because it's very root bound, that's a different issue. But if I've got a plant that isn't particularly root bound, but I'm thinking, oh, maybe I'll transfer it to semi-hydro, however, it hasn't grown in a really long time, I would probably hold off doing that or chopping that to propagate. I have, as I've said before, I use grow lights, humidifiers, I use all sorts of things in my house in order to try and replicate the best growing conditions I possibly can. And therefore that does allow me to be able to do pretty much whatever I want to my plants, because it kind of feels like summer conditions for them. So yeah, if you're able to keep things stable, go ahead and do it. If you're not, or if you're in any doubt and it's not immediately urgent for your plant in order to survive, I would say don't bother. The next myth is that all tropical plants require high humidity. I think if this was true, a lot of people wouldn't have houseplants, because I don't know about you guys, I know tons of people that I wouldn't consider to be like uber planty people that have a houseplant or two in their homes and they're doing all right. There are plenty of tropical plants that don't need high levels of humidity in order to survive. They don't need anything extra put in place. The first thing that came to mind for me was aglaonema, certain types of anthurium, even certain types of alocasia like the regal shield. They will do absolutely fine at standard room humidity. Things like Hoya as well, Acanthus, you name it, there are tons of them. I think this myth forms from the fact that tropical plants as a whole they typically come from a very humid environment, most of them, and therefore will appreciate and do well in higher levels of humidity. But that does not mean that every single one of them will require super high levels in order to survive. The next one is that curling leaves always means a plant is thirsty. And yes, sometimes this can mean a plant is thirsty. I know I have said, for example, with things like the pothos plant, Epipremnum, that one is usually very easy to tell when it needs a drink because all of its leaves will curl and I'll go, cool, I will go ahead and water that plant. The same goes for loads, in fact, like Calathea, peace lilies. However, it is not the only reason that your plant's leaves can be curling, and this is where, if you're first starting out with houseplants, it can be a little bit confusing because actually curling leaves is one of the biggest signs of overwatering as well. It can mean that you have overwatered your plant, perhaps your plant has root rot, perhaps it's just drowning and it can't process the water that you've given it. And in order to be able to kind of detect whether or not you're dealing with underwatering or overwatering, unless you've got a plant that you know very, very well and you know its watering schedule and you know that it's only just started to dry out and this is very normal, again, I'm repeating myself, but I would check the roots. If you, for example, if you look in the substrate and you see that the roots are quite slushy or maybe the soil is quite waterlogged and there's a lot of moisture still in there, I would act fast because I would think that you've probably accidentally overwatered your plant. Whereas if you look at the soil and you see that it's really, really dry or if you're using semi-hydro, the reservoir is really, really low, then I would assume that you're dealing with underwatering. I have made videos, if you search on my channel, I have made videos specifically about how to deal with the consequences of overwatering before, things like dealing with root rots and rehabbing plants and all sorts. So I will link some of those videos down below. But yes, a lot of the time it can be due to underwatering, but not always. Myth number 10 is that plants will stop growing over the winter months, and I have touched on this briefly already, but it really comes down to the conditions of your house. Again, we are talking most of the time when we talk about houseplants as tropical plants. Tropical plants thrive in a warm, humid, bright environment. So if you are able to replicate those things in your home over the colder, darker winter months, then chances are you can keep your plants growing all year round. That is certainly what I aim for in my collection. I realise I'm very, very lucky with the space that I've got. It does have some natural light and then it does have grow lights and all of that sort of stuff. But even if you just create like a little corner with a heat mat and a grow light, you can get grow lights super, super cheaply online. You can use like little mini cabinet setups or plastic bags even to create higher levels of humidity. It is possible to keep your plants growing all through the year. However, if they do stop growing over the winter months, this is also normal and it's nothing to worry about. A lot of the time, when tropical plants aren't getting their needs met, i.e. not enough light, heat or humidity or nutrients, assuming they are still growing, then that can put them into a period of dormancy. And I have had that with my plants before. When I had to move back home during lockdown, I moved back to my mum's house in her very cold conservatory over winter, and loads of my plants went dormant because I just couldn't keep the temperature high enough. And they all bounced back when spring came. So yeah, nothing to worry about, but it is definitely possible to keep them growing. And the next one is that rainwater is always best for your plants. Again, this is something that I didn't even really think that hard about until years of owning plants. I used to put a bucket outside religiously every single evening. If I thought it was going to rain, I would take it in and I would water my plants with it. And I was like, woohoo, I'm doing all the right things. This is so much better than tap water. And it really comes down to where you live and the quality of your tap water, and whether or not you live in a really polluted town, for example, because if you live in an area with very high pollution, that is going to essentially come down with the rainwater. And when you water your plants, you are also not only going to be giving them the goodness of the rainwater, you're also going to be giving them pollutants. So in that case, it might be that using tap water and adding something like a chemical neutralizer into it. I found out about this again fairly recently in the last few years, that actually using something like Tap Safe, that is commonly used for goldfish and other freshwater fish, that can be quite good to help neutralize things for your house plants. And I have tried it on my plants and my plants seemed fine with it. I'm quite lucky in where I live, the tap water isn't particularly hard, so I do use tap water for pretty much all of my plants, even my calatheas. The only ones that I do struggle using tap water on are my carnivorous plants, and this seems to be a unanimous thing. They are super sensitive, so I will personally use rainwater for them. The best thing you can possibly do, regardless of where you are in the world or your water conditions or any of that sort of stuff, if you want it to be perfect and pristine for your plants, is get a reverse osmosis filter, because reverse osmosis water is brilliant for your plants. It is super pure. However, it's not cheap. You can have them, I believe, fitted to like your main taps in your home. It costs thousands and thousands of pounds where I live, so I have not had it done. I think you can buy little reverse osmosis water tanks as well on Amazon. I have searched for this before. I've never done it myself, but I hear fantastic things. Again, filtered water can be great. And if you are lucky enough to not live in a super polluted area, or if your plants respond well to it, yes, rainwater's great, but it is definitely not necessary. And the next myth is that you need to rotate your plants weekly. This is definitely not the case. I mean, weekly, that is effort. Can you imagine if I had to rotate every single one of my plants weekly? I would be here all day. It would be ridiculous. So firstly, you don't need to ever rotate your plants if you don't want to. Like, I have got multiple plants that I'm perfectly happy with. For example, plants on moss poles like this. All of their growth faces one way, and I wouldn't want it any other way. I think it would look really weird if I had a plant on a moss pole and all of its growth was going out left, right and centre. I also think it would probably be more stressful for the plant if I was trying to rotate it when all of its growth was trying to go one way. The reason people say to rotate plants regularly is if you've got a plant, again, I'm going to use my Musa as an example, this one here, which does kind of have quite round 360 growth. If you want to keep it looking full and bushy and not just like turned to one side, then yes, rotating it regularly is a good idea. Again, for things like Aglaonema, I do typically rotate them just because I quite like the kind of full bushy appearance that comes with them being like 360 growth and not just like one way. But it's really down to personal preference, and if you do it, you definitely don't have to do it every single week. I will do it as and when I think of it, which can be once a month. It could be once every 4 months, or when you notice that the growth is starting to turn that way, then give them a spin. But again, it's really down to personal preference. It is not something you have to do. This next one again feels like another lockdown hack, and it is ice cubes are a great watering method. And if you haven't heard of this watering method, it basically involves taking lots of ice cubes and putting them on top of the substrate of your plant, regardless of the substrate. I feel like people were doing this for orchids a lot for a while. But essentially, as the ice melts, obviously it will slowly break down and the plant will gradually be able to feed. And I think the theory behind this was that people were saying it would be harder to overwater. This for me is wrong for so many reasons. Firstly, you're putting ice cold water into your plant, which I would never recommend you to do. Personally, I always try and use like room temperature or even like a little bit lukewarm water because it's easier for your plants to process. It's not gonna suddenly throw them into shock as opposed to icy cold water. But also, if you are just putting ice on top of your plants, that is targeted watering. It's only going to be getting certain areas of the root system. You're not going to be able to kind of thoroughly make sure you're getting all of it, which is something that I always think is very important. And also, you're not really going to be able to monitor how much you're giving it because I don't know, I like to be able to completely drench my plants through, let them drain, and I don't count how much water I give them, assuming they're ready for a drink. I just drench them, and you obviously can't do that with ice. So no, this is not something I would recommend. If you're going away and you want to do this when you're going away, but I mean, the ice is going to have melted within a day, isn't it? I think if you have to take the targeted watering approach, and I know for some people that is unavoidable if you are going away for several weeks, something like the watering globes that you can get, which basically are these like slow release little globes that you fill with water and you stick into your soil and they will drip feed water down into the substrate. I still wouldn't personally recommend using them for the same reasons that I've just said about the ice, like targeted watering and the fact that you can't monitor exactly how much, but I would say that's better than nothing. I would not recommend ice cubes. Myth number 14 is that you can reuse soil time after time. And I am all for reusing things. I absolutely don't think we should just be binning our soil after the first time we've used it, but I think it really depends. It depends on the plant and it depends on the quality of the soil, because for me, a lot of the time, if I've been growing a plant in soil for like a couple of years, by the time I take it out of that soil, the soil is going to be completely drained of nutrients, and also just the quality of the soil is going to be really, really bad. So again, the aeration is likely to be very, very poor around the roots of whatever plant I was to use it on next. So yeah, typically I will allow plants to grow in soil for as long as it comes to the point that they need a repot. And if the soil looks fantastic, or if a plant has outgrown that soil, that pot size very, very quickly, like for example, if I've repotted a plant and the roots have gone crazy and it's only a few months later, yes, I will, assuming there's no soil pests or anything like that, or any fungal issues or anything to be concerned about, yes, I will reuse that soil. But otherwise, no, I won't. I will always compost it unless, again, there are pests like soil mealybugs or anything like that. I will always compost it. If I find pests, I will put it in the bin, just because that's not something that you want to kind of continue spreading. Yeah, there are many times where I decide I'm not going to use the soil again. I really like as well, when you repot a plant and you're trying to kind of scale it up and do the best you possibly can for it, I really like putting it into fresh soil that feels packed with nutrition, and I just feel the plant is going to do brilliantly in. Whereas if I was putting it into secondhand soil that was very depleted of nutrients, it would hardly be worth repotting the plant, you know? And a lot of you will know my thoughts and feelings towards this next one, but the next myth is that plants prefer a schedule when you water them. Okay, don't get me wrong. I know there are lots of good watering apps that you can get nowadays. And for some people, these are really, really useful. I don't want to take that away from you. But for me, I would say never schedule your watering. Like, it is really quite dangerous if you say... dangerous in the plant world. It's really quite dangerous if you say, I'm going to water this plant once a week exactly. And during the summer months, that works perfectly. Once a week is great. The plant is getting loads of heat, it's getting loads of light, it's putting out loads of growth. Once a week, great. However, then when we go into the colder, darker winter months, despite the fact that I'm putting measures in place to try and keep the summer conditions like grow lights, humidifiers, all the things we've spoken about, the plant's environment is still going to have shifted, and therefore the intake of water that it should be receiving is going to have to be adjusted. So again, if I continue to water it once a week throughout winter, I might start to cause issues in that plant very, very quickly. So yeah, I always say the best thing that I would recommend to do, and has worked wonders with my houseplants, is just get to know what your plant likes. If it's a plant that likes to be pretty much bone dry before you water it again, cool, group that together with loads of other plants that also like that. And the same goes for if it's a plant that really loves to be kept consistently moist or likes to dry out about halfway. If you group those plants together, you can then kind of monitor them all and make sure you're keeping on top of them without having to be like, on the 4th Tuesday of every second month, I will water this plant, you know, because long term, it's not going to keep your plants happy. As I say, I don't personally use any of the watering apps, but I do know that for some people, if, for example, you just forget to water your plants, it can just be a really great reminder, even just to go and like check on them. But I would always check before jumping in and guessing. The next myth is that you can't propagate woody stems, and I completely understand why a lot of you might think this and why sometimes it might be a little bit harder, but it is very much possible. A lot of the time these woody stems start to occur when either a plant is quite mature, like it's often known as corking, when a plant will essentially kind of reinforce itself and create more of a tree-like structure at the base to kind of like strengthen itself so that it can support the weight and like keep sturdy. That section can absolutely still be propagated. And in fact, a really good example of this is my mum's got a fig tree in her garden, which is very woody and tree-like in its structure. And we decided to propagate that a couple of years ago, and we decided to air layer it before we chopped it so that we could make sure there were some roots. And so we packed loads. This was kind of an experiment that I did when I was living back at my mum's house. But I packed loads of soil and sphagnum moss around one of the branches on a point where another branch was coming off, so a node. I wrapped that in loads of cling film, made sure it stayed hydrated, and it rooted beautifully into that. And we were then able to chop that branch off, pot it in the ground, and voila, we had a brand new plant. I think sometimes if you are concerned about this for that reason, air layering can be a really good way to start. If you want to ensure that there is even just a little bit of root to get you going, if you are worried that it might be quite a difficult one to propagate, do it that way. But no, woody stems can absolutely be propagated. And next is bigger pots are always better. No, that is just not the case. Obviously, if you're talking about a very big plant with a very big root system, give it a pot where the root system can actually kind of breathe a bit. Yes, don't pot it in something ridiculously small. However, if you put a plant that has a root system about that big in a planted that is that big, again, that is a classic way to cause root rot, because again, your plant's it's not going to be able to absorb all of the moisture that is held in the substrate, and it's going to be completely overwhelmed with moisture, and it's going to start breaking down, it's going to start rotting, and it's not going to be able to fill the pot at the rate that you want. So yeah, unless I have got a plant, like again, I'm sat next to this one grows so quickly and its roots are insane. Or in fact, the one I showed you, the Musa, with roots that are already coming out of the bottom of the pot. Next time I repot those two, I won't be scared to go like quite a few sizes bigger, because I have faith that they can fill them quite quickly. But if you're not sure, I would just upsize 1 or 2 pot sizes at a time. It's always better to do that than it is to give your plant too much and overwhelm the roots. Number 18, cutting off the aerial roots harms your plant. This is a question that I've had so many times over the years, particularly relating to Monstera deliciosa, which in its mature kind of adult form puts out crazy aerial roots. Like, they go everywhere. And the answer to this is no. It's not going to do your plant any harm per se if you cut off the aerial roots, if you want to kind of like neaten things up a bit. I wouldn't always necessarily recommend doing that, purely for the fact that aerial roots are there to help stabilize your plant as your plant grows and matures. And if you want to grow a really big plant, even like not right now, if you want one day this to turn into a really big plant, I would be tempted to encourage those aerial roots either back down into the soil, the substrate, or get your plant a moss pole and encourage them into something like that and allow it to climb. Some people do use wooden planks and stuff like that, which you can totally do, or cork bark. It just doesn't allow you to like chop and extend in the same way as it would if you had like a really big root system in a moss pole. So yeah, although I know it is very tempting sometimes when you've got crazy roots coming out left, right and centre to just go, you know what, I'm going to chop you off. I've done it myself in the past as well, and it has not done any harm to the plants. Nowadays, I typically do leave them on. And the other thing you have to think about as well, if you want your plant to kind of size up quickly and be as healthy as it possibly can, by removing the aerial roots, you're also removing the potential for that plant to be able to absorb lots of micronutrients. So, i.e. if you give that plant a moss pole and you fertilise the moss pole, it's getting like double nutrients from its main root system in the soil and from the ones that the aerial roots are absorbing goodness from, if that makes sense. The next one is that coffee grounds are a great fertiliser, and I understand why people say it, and I have many times over the years tried and tested coffee grounds on my houseplants, and the reason that I would nowadays say no, it is not a good fertiliser is firstly and mainly, and this is something I didn't know years ago, but mainly is that it can really alter the pH of your soil, which for some plants, like for example, African violets that like quite an acidic soil, that might not be an issue, but for other plants that could throw them into shock and really damage them and really cause nasty things to happen to the foliage, and it might not be immediately clear why initially. But the other thing that I found with using coffee grounds in my substrates, in my soil, I would never use it with semi-hydro because again, that would make the plant more prone to root rot. But if I was to mix it in with one of my soils, again, it really wrecks the aeration of the soil. It means that it will become much more compact and the roots won't be able to breathe, leading to more root issues such as root rot. And also, if you sprinkle it on top and water it through, it can mean that it gets very mouldy, which is just gross to have in the house. So I would say if you've got like, I don't know, if you've got citrus trees or something that would quite enjoy an acidic soil outside, maybe if you want to reuse your coffee grounds, kind of mix a few in with that, probably no harm done. But again, I would advise composting if you're able to. I don't know what the rules are with coffee grounds and something like a wormery actually. But I was going to say, if you don't have access to compost, you could do something like that. Research that before you do it, because I don't know if that's okay. But yeah, personally, nowadays, I would not recommend doing that as houseplant fertiliser. Just get a good fertiliser. Get a good fertiliser. And finally, number 20. This is one that comes up time after time after time, and I get so many questions about it. And it is misting raises the humidity. It has been a big old debate in the houseplant community for as long as I can remember. And so, yes, misting does temporarily raise the humidity levels for your plants. Like for example, if I was to come in here with a spray bottle first thing this morning and I was to spray all of my plants and then check my humidity gauge, chances are for the next hour or two, I might notice that levels were slightly raised. However, it's a very temporary thing. As soon as that water's evaporated, the humidity is going to be pretty much gone. So if you want to raise the humidity with misting, you're basically going to have to be misting your plants non-stop all the time. And it's just not worth it. It's just not worth it. The other thing as well, with misting and actually putting water onto their leaves, you massively increase the chances of things like fungal disease, particularly for plants that are like, for example, I'm looking at my anthurium behind me, velvet leaf plants. If they don't have good airflow, then it is just not a good thing to have water sitting on their leaves. It can do them so much harm, and it can lead to mildew and all these things that you really don't want. So bearing in mind, I know, again, like I've said already in this video, there are lots of other good DIY methods available in order to raise the humidity, but also bearing in mind you can nowadays get cheap little humidifiers for about £5 on Amazon. I know that's still not accessible to everyone, but I would personally recommend, instead of buying that next plant that you're inevitably going to buy a humidifier instead, because the plants that you've already got are going to massively thank you for it, and it is going to be so much more worth it in the long run than having to exhaust your finger and all the time that you'll spend misting your plants. It's just not worth it. So yeah, I have put that one into the myth category because I don't think it is a sustainable or effective way to raise the humidity for your houseplants. But those are all 20 of the myths that I've got for you today. I had so much fun putting this together. Please let me know some of the other myths that you've heard down in the comments below, or if you think I've missed anything, or if you've got anything to add, please let me know. I always love hearing from you guys. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, have a lovely day, and I will see you in the next video.
Stay sexy, plant lovers.